If you're ready to explore the wild, rebellious, and downright mind-bending ideas of history's most unconventional philosophers, then prepare yourself for a deep dive into the world of radical thought. These philosophers didn't just challenge the status quo, they shattered it. Their ideas were so unorthodox, so provocative, and often so disorienting that they have sparked intense debates and enduring controversies for centuries. They pushed the very boundaries of reason, questioning everything from the nature of morality and existence to the fundamental structure of reality itself. What makes these philosophers particularly fascinating and crazy in the best possible sense is their willingness to reject societal norms, disrupt conventional wisdom, and embrace unpredictability. They weren't afraid to venture into the irrational, the absurd, or the taboo in their quest to answer the most pressing questions about life, meaning, and the human condition. Each of these thinkers was, in their own way, a radical visionary, willing to transform the very nature of philosophy and thought. Their works didn't just alter the course of intellectual history, they redefined the boundaries of what it means to think deeply about the world. If you're intrigued by sun-setting ideas that challenge the way you think about everything, freedom, morality, knowledge, and even existence itself, then these philosophers are not just worthy of study, they are essential to understanding the full scope of human thought, revealing how daring and unpredictable philosophy can truly be. So, buckle up as we explore 5 thinkers who are anything but conventional, each of whom dared to ask questions that no one had ever dared to ask before, and whose ideas continue to reverberate through modern thought in profound, disruptive ways. Diogenes of Sinope, the philosopher who lived in defiance. Diogenes of Sinope, cf. Sinope, 432 BCE, is arguably the most iconic and radical figure in ancient Greek philosophy. He was a central figure in the school of society in favor of simplicity, self-sufficiency, and living in accordance with nature. Diogenes took this philosophy to extremes that bordered on the absurd, and his life and teachings challenged not only the intellectual norms of his time, but also social and moral conventions at their core. Diogenes didn't simply question the established norms, he violently rejected them, often in ways that would be shocking even by modern standards. His philosophy was not just intellectual, it was a direct confrontation with the hypocrisies and contradictions of his contemporaries. Diogenes is remembered not only for his radical ideas, but for the extreme and often outrageous ways in which he embodied those ideas. His life was an act of constant provocation, a perpetual challenge to the world around him. The Cynic philosophy, rejection of conventional society. Before delving into Diogenes' own practices, it's important to understand the broader philosophical movement of Cynicism, of which he was a leading figure. Cynicism originated in ancient Greece with the teachings of Antisthenes, a disciple of Socrates. However, it was Diogenes who gave it its most extreme expression. The Cynics believed that human beings were fundamentally corrupt due to their attachment to material wealth, social status, and the conventions of society. They argued that true happiness could only be found by living in accordance with nature, free from the constraints of social conventions, material desires, and artificial morality. They saw themselves as radical outsiders, rejecting the comforts and hypocrisies of society in favor of a life of simplicity and asceticism. For Diogenes, living in accordance with nature meant embracing a lifestyle that was as far from the refined, civilized society of Athens as possible. He scorned luxury, wealth, and social status, preferring to live a life of extreme poverty and self-sufficiency. Unlike many philosophers whose ideas were articulated through abstract reasoning, Diogenes' philosophy was put into action through his rejection of the prevailing values of his time. Diogenes' radical lifestyle. 1. Living in a barrel. Perhaps the most iconic image associated with Diogenes is that of him living in a barrel, or sometimes described as a large ceramic jar, in Athens. He famously eschewed all material comforts, choosing to live in the most primitive of conditions. By choosing such a humble and uncomfortable dwelling, Diogenes made a deliberate statement about his rejection of wealth, luxury, and the materialism of Athenian society. For Diogenes, a barrel wasn't just a practical dwelling. It was a symbol of his freedom from the trappings of civilization. This lifestyle of extreme poverty was not born out of necessity. Diogenes could have sought shelter and support from wealthier patrons, but rather was a choice to live in a way that was completely in tune with the most basic human needs. By giving up the comforts of home, Diogenes made a mockery of the idea that wealth or status could provide true happiness or fulfillment. He believed that self-sufficiency was the key to a fulfilling life, and that all human desires beyond the basic needs of survival were distractions. 2. Public provocations and shocking acts. Diogenes was not content with simply rejecting materialism. He actively challenged social norms by engaging in public acts that were designed to shock, offend, and provoke his fellow citizens. His behavior was deliberately outrageous, intended to expose the hypocrisies and contradictions of Athenian society. Diogenes was a master of scandal, and he used scandal as a tool to highlight what he saw as the moral rot beneath the surface of Athenian culture. One of Diogenes' most famous acts of defiance occurred when he wandered the streets of Athens during the day with a lantern, declaring that he was looking for an honest man. This was a pointed critique of Athenian society, which Diogenes saw as full of deceit, corruption, and false pretensions. His claim that he couldn't find a single honest person was an uncompromising judgment of the society around him. In a city known for its philosophers, politicians, and wealthy elites, Diogenes pointed out the pervasive hypocrisy and self-interest that underpinned their actions. The act itself, wandering around in daylight with a lantern, searching for something that didn't exist, was a symbol of despair about the moral state of society. Diogenes would also frequently engage in acts that broke social taboos and norms, such as publicly defecating, urinating, and masturbating in public places, particularly in the marketplace. These acts were not merely for shock value, but were intended to expose the absurdity of social rules around decency and civility. Diogenes believed that such rules were arbitrary, and that human nature should not be repressed by societal conventions. By engaging in these acts, he challenged the very foundations of civilized society, calling attention to the artificial boundaries placed around human behavior. 3. Deal at a table. Confronting Alexander the Great. Perhaps the most famous confrontation Diogenes had was with Alexander the Great, one of the most powerful rulers in the world. When Alexander came across Diogenes basking in the sun, he offered to grant Diogenes any wish he desired, promising wealth, land, or power. Diogenes' response was a stunning act of defiance. He said, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." This was not just a witty remark, it was an outright rejection of the idea that political power, wealth, or fame could offer anything of true value. Diogenes was making a clear statement that nothing mattered more to him than his own simple pleasure of basking in the sun. For Diogenes, the pursuit of power, wealth, and glory was meaningless, and he would not be swayed by the promises of even the most powerful man in the world. He rejected external authority in favor of inner freedom, proving that material wealth or political power were ultimately empty pursuits. This moment with Alexander highlights a central tenet of Diogenes' philosophy, the complete rejection of hierarchical power. To Diogenes, all human beings were inherently equal, and the idea that one person could have power over another was a corruption of human nature. In his view, the true measure of freedom was not political influence or wealth, but the ability to live a life free from external pressures and self-imposed desires. 4. The Cynic's challenge to conventional morality. Diogenes' acts of public defiance weren't just about individual freedom. They were also about challenging the moral foundations of society. By rejecting the moral codes of his time, Diogenes aimed to show how these codes were often hypocritical and self-serving. He lived without regard for the expectations of others, including the moral and social norms of Athens. His rejection of traditional morality was not about promoting anarchy for its own sake. It was about showing the artificial nature of societal rules and the possibility of living outside them. For Diogenes, true virtue was not about adhering to prescribed norms or rituals, but about living in a way that was authentic to one's nature. He believed that living according to nature was the only way to find true peace and fulfillment. His lifestyle was a deliberate and pointed critique of a society that placed too much emphasis on wealth, status, and material possessions. Diogenes' legacy, a radical example of freedom. Diogenes of Sinope's life and philosophy stand as one of the most extreme and provocative examples of individual freedom in the history of philosophy. His rejection of societal norms and materialism was not just an intellectual critique. It was a radical lifestyle choice, one that was meant to shake people out of their complacency and force them to confront the artificiality of their lives. His public acts of defiance were designed to challenge the status quo and expose the hypocrisy and absurdity of social conventions. While Diogenes' ideas and practices were often seen as eccentric and extreme, they have had a lasting impact on the history of philosophy. He is often regarded as one of the founding figures of Western philosophy, and his radical ideas about the nature of virtue, self-sufficiency, and freedom have influenced countless philosophers and thinkers throughout the centuries. His Cynic philosophy, which emphasizes simplicity, independence, and a rejection of society conventions, remains a powerful and controversial force in contemporary thought. Diogenes' life was not just an intellectual rebellion, it was a rebellion against the very structure of human existence as it was understood in his time. He lived his philosophy, and in doing so, he challenged every person. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher of language and the limits of thought. Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1-8-9-1-9-5-1, is one of the most important and enigmatic figures in 20th century philosophy. His work fundamentally altered the landscape of philosophy of language and epistemology, and his thoughts on the limits of language, the nature of meaning, and the relation between thought and reality have shaped modern debates about meaning, truth, and the structure of human knowledge. Wittgenstein's two major works, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophus, 1921, and Philosophical Investigations, 1953, represent deeply concern with the question of how language functions and how it relates to the world. Wittgenstein's work is often seen as a bridge between the traditions of analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, and his ideas have influenced areas ranging from linguistics and logic to psychology and aesthetics. While Wittgenstein's ideas are often viewed as difficult and abstract, his work also carries a profoundly human concern with how we understand and communicate the world we inhabit. The Tractatus Logico-Philosophus picture theory of meaning. Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus is an early work that deals with the relationship between language, reality, and thought. Written during his time as a soldier in World War I, the work is a logical investigation of how language can represent facts about the world. Wittgenstein's aim in the Tractatus is to establish the boundaries of what can be meaningfully said and what must remain unsaid. Why? The picture theory of meaning. At the heart of the Tractatus is Wittgenstein's picture theory of meaning, which suggests that language functions by representing the world in a manner similar to a picture. According to Wittgenstein, a proposition is a picture of a possible state of affairs. It represents a fact about the world. Just as a picture can represent a scene by mirroring the elements of that scene, a picture of a tree represents a tree by capturing its shape, color, and structure. A sentence in language represents a state of affairs by corresponding to the structure of reality. Wittgenstein's idea is that the structure of language mirrors the structure of the world. The world is made up of facts, not things, and propositions represent these facts. A fact consists of a combination of objects or entities in a particular relation. For example, the sentence, "The cat is on the mat," represents a fact because it mirrors the possible arrangement of the cat and the mat in a specific relation. Wittgenstein also argues that meaning is tied to reference. The meaning of a word is derived from the way it relates to a particular object or state of affairs in the world. 2. Limits of language and the unsayable. A central idea in the Tractatus is the limit of what can be meaningfully said. Wittgenstein argues that language can only meaningfully represent facts, or what is empirically verifiable. Anything that falls outside the scope of facts, such as metaphysical speculation, ethics, and aesthetics, is not subject to meaningful language. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. For Wittgenstein, questions about ethics, religion, and other transcendent topics do not have logical or empirical answers, and therefore they fall outside the realm of meaningful discourse. Wittgenstein is not denying the importance of these topics. Rather, he is asserting that they cannot be discussed meaningfully through language, which is limited to representing facts. In this sense, the Tractatus draws a sharp boundary between what can be said, i.e., that which is verifiable through empirical observation or logical analysis, and what cannot be said, metaphysics and other matters that are beyond the scope of factual description. Belif nagamar if machemont. Philosophical Inaptimations. Ordinary language philosophy. Wittgenstein's later work, Philosophical Investigations, marks a significant shift in his thinking. No longer interested in the logical structure of language, Wittgenstein turns his attention to how language is used in everyday life. This shift is often seen as a move from a logical conception of meaning to a pragmatic one, where the use of words in particular contexts takes center stage. Wittgenstein abandons the strict framework of the Tractatus and instead focuses on the ordinary uses of language to explore the nature of meaning, understanding, and reference. 1. Language games and forms of life. In the Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein introduces the concept of language games, the idea that the meaning of words is shaped by their use in various forms of human activity. Wittgenstein asserts that language is not a monolithic system of representations, but rather a complex array of practices in which words are used in different ways, depending on the context and the activities in which they are embedded. Each language game is a particular form of life, a shared way of interacting with the world that shapes how we use language. A language game is any activity where language plays a role, such as giving directions, making promises, or describing a scene. Wittgenstein argues that the meaning of a word is determined by its function within a specific language game. For instance, the word cat means something different in the context of a scientific description of a biological species, a child's storybook, or a veterinary consultation. Wittgenstein's view is that meaning is not static or determined by some metaphysical essence, but is fluid and context-dependent, arising from the way language is used in everyday practice. 2. Family resemblance and the fuzzy boundaries of meaning. A key feature of Wittgenstein's later philosophy is his idea of family resemblance. In contrast to the idea that words have precise definitions or fixed essences, Wittgenstein argues that the meanings of many words are connected by a web of overlapping similarities. Just as family members may share a range of features, either similar facial features, mannerisms, or temperaments, without any one feature being essential, the meanings of words are connected by a series of resemblances or similarities, rather than a strict definition. For example, the concept of games doesn't have a single characteristic that all games share. Some games involve physical activity, others don't. Some are competitive, others are cooperative. Instead, there are overlapping features that connect different types of games, and language functions in a similar way. The meaning of words like game, family, or pain is not fixed by some essential core, but is understood through the context in which they are used and the shared practices in which they are embedded. 3. Critique of private language. Another important aspect of Wittgenstein's later work is his critique of the notion of a private language. The idea that an individual could have a language that is known only to them and not accessible to others. Wittgenstein argues that language is inherently social and that meaning depends on shared practices. A private language in which words only refer to the inner states or sensations of a single individual is incoherent, because language cannot function without a public standard of meaning. For Wittgenstein, meaning is not something that exists solely in the mind of the individual, but is shaped by social interactions and common practices. Wittgenstein's legacy, the revolution in philosophy of language. Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations marked a radical departure from traditional philosophy, particularly in how it approached the problem of meaning. His later work, often called ordinary language philosophy, emphasized that philosophical problems arise when language is used outside of its normal context, or when it is treated as if it has a precise, fixed meaning. Wittgenstein's emphasis on the fluidity of meaning and the importance of context has had a profound impact on various fields, including linguistics, semiotics, philosophy of mind, and cognitive science. His critique of traditional metaphysics and epistemology has inspired thinkers in the analytic tradition, such as Gilbert Austin and Gilbert Ryle. as well as more contemporary figures in pragmatism and post-analytic philosophy. Wittgenstein's work is also foundational to the philosophy of mind, especially in debates about the nature of consciousness and the relationship between language and thought. In addition, Wittgenstein's exploration of the limits of thought and the nature of reality continues to resonate in contemporary philosophy of science and epistemology. His challenge to the idea of a fixed, objective reality that can be fully described by language has influenced postmodern philosophers like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Richard Rorty, who questioned the possibility of objective. As you journey through the minds of these audacious philosophers, it becomes clear thinking outside the box is only the beginning. These thinkers didn't just color outside the lines, they burned the box to the ground and rebuilt the world of ideas from scratch. They dared to question the unquestionable, reject the absurd, and confront the absurd head-on. In doing so, they opened the door to a new kind of thinking, disruptive, unpredictable, and often uncomfortable, but undeniably transformative. So the real question is, are you ready to rethink everything you thought you knew? Because once you've glimpsed the chaotic brilliance of these thinkers, you won't be able to see the world the same way again. The boundaries of reason are not as solid as they seem, and philosophy, as these philosophers have shown, is as much about challenging the status quo as it is about understanding it. These minds have left a mark on history, not by conforming, but by redefining what it means to truly understand the world. And in the process, they've forced us all to confront the limits of our own thinking. The question isn't just what did these philosophers think, it's how far are you willing to go in your own quest for truth? Because philosophy doesn't stop at the surface. It digs deeper, challenges more, and dares you to question the very fabric of reality itself.